So if Dove will come up here and join me. When thinking about the work that Dove does, it occurred to me that oftentimes people who are abused by their partner or children who are abused by their parent, we often say, you know, what can we do? How is it possible for us to make an impact on their lives? And it occurs to me that the story of the Good Samaritan answers that question, answers it powerfully. And let me share these incredible words that come from Jesus. Jesus said, a certain man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when robbers attacked him, stripped him, and beat him up, leaving him half dead. So it happened that a priest or a minister or a rabbi was going by that road. When he saw the man, he walked on by on the other side. In the same way, a Levite who also came by went over and looked at the man and then walked on by on the other side. But a certain Samaritan, and please don't miss the importance of that, because the Samaritan were hated part of the Jewish community. Certain Samaritan who was traveling that way came upon him, and when he saw the man, his heart was filled with pity or compassion. He went over to him, poured oil and wine on his wounds, bandaged him, and then he put the man on his own animal and took him to an inn where he took care of him. The next day he took out 2 silver coins and gave them to the innkeeper. Take care of him, he told the innkeeper, and when I come back this way, I will pay you back whatever you spent on him. And Jesus concluded, which one of these 3 seems to you to have been a neighbor to the man attacked by the robbers? The teacher of the law answered, the one who was kind to him. Jesus replied, you go then and do the same. I'm pleased to welcome Dove.
Good morning. Well, that's good to hear. You did a pretty good job this morning.
First, have that closer to your.
Okay, so I've never been accused of not having a big enough mouth, but we'll move it so the folks on the TV can hear me. So when I was a child growing up in southeastern Michigan, my mother cleaned the church in our small rural community. I belonged to a Quaker church. And Saturdays we'd go in, and it'd take her about 2 hours to clean the church. And as a child, I'd help her where I could. I remember going along the pews of the church and dusting off the bottom so that everything looked good for our Sunday morning services. When I got done, Mom usually still had some stuff to do, and I'd have about an hour and a half or so to do as I pleased, which sometimes would be homework, but more often than not would find me up at the front of the church. And thinking someday I was going to be a great pastor in the lines of Billy Graham and some other folks, I would practice giving sermons and singing as loud as I could, waking up, well, there wasn't a cemetery close by, so I guess I wasn't waking up the dead, but my mother often said I was. But I just have to tell you that I could fill up that 1.5 or 2 hours. So if you got pot roasts in the oven, I apologize now if you get home a little late. Just kidding. Everybody's like, oh no, there goes the pot roast. So when I do presentations regarding Dove or other places that I've worked, I try to make them a part of what you already know. And I tend to go a little bit farther when I'm in a church, because I believe that the lessons we can learn from the scripture can help us explain so many things in life. And it was interesting to me, last night I was doing some research and I came across, I was doing some really specific research and came across this article about the United Methodist General Board of Church. Now, this was in 2012, so I'm hoping it's still applicable. But in 2012, in articulating our theology, the church mentioned that in the Book of Discipline, in the social principles section, it states, we recognize that family violence and abuse in all its forms, verbal, psychological, physical, sexual, is detrimental to the covenant of the human community. We encourage the church to provide a safe environment or sanctuary, counsel, and support for the victim. While we deplore the actions of the abuser, we affirm that person to be in need of God's redeeming love. In a resolution titled Eradicating Sexual and Gender-Based Violence passed at the 2016 General Conference, it called the church to raise awareness of sexual and gender-based violence, stating, the church must re-examine the theological messages it communicates in light of the experiences of victims of sexual and gender-based violence. Part of our call as individuals and as a church is seeking to address the root causes of violence, working to eradicate it in its multiple forms, and being God's instruments for the wholeness of affected women and children. And I would add to that now affected women, men, and children. So what, if anything, does the Bible say about domestic violence or sexual violence? Well, we all know in the beginning, after Adam and Eve, they had a couple of boys, Cain and Abel. And as boys were wont to do, I'm sure that growing up they had their squabbles, but as they matured, Cain became known for his ability to work the land. And Abel became known for his sheep flock and the wondrous sheep that he produced. Well, at one point, God called to them and said it was time for them to give a sacrifice of the best of what they had. And so we all know that Cain brought some of his wheat from his field. Perhaps the way the story reads, it wasn't even the best of the wheat. Abel, on the other hand, brought one of his prized sheep. In fact, it may have been a young lamb that had been fattened up specifically for this purpose, and that God was pleased with Abel's sacrifice and actually sent down fire from the sky and burned his sacrifice. Well, Cain, being the jealous sort, decided to kill Abel, and he did. And so from there, we have one of the first stories of domestic violence. Interestingly, and just as a side note, this story is present in all three tomes of the Abrahamic faiths, the Jewish Talmud, the Muslim Quran, and the Christian Bible. And I tell you that just to say that, you know, it's amazing how these stories, these parables, these truths pass from one religion to another because of their importance. Now, what else does the Bible say? Well, in 2 Samuel chapter 13, there's the story of Tamar, a daughter of King David. Amnon, Tamar's half-brother, falls in love with her to the point that in verse 2, in the New International Version, it actually says he was obsessed with her. And we know in the work that we do at Dove that one of the things that happens in abusive relationship is the batterer becomes obsessed with controlling their victim. For them, that control, that power is what they're looking for. Now, Amnon had a cousin, Jonadab, who was actually his cousin, well, like I said, his cousin, but was also served as Amnon's advisor. And Amnon and Jonadab came up with this plan to get Tamar into his room in order for Tamar to be able to rape her, or for Amnon to rape her. And when Tamar figured out what he was planning, she tried to initially talk Amnon out of raping her, and even said to him, "Go speak to King David. I'm sure he will allow you to marry me." Because being raped was the most horrific thing that could happen to a woman one of the most horrific things that could happen to a woman in that time. But it didn't help, and she was raped anyway. So then once Amnon had raped Tamar, Tamar begged him not to send her out, but it said that Amnon was so disgusted with her that he threw her out of his home. Tamar went to her brother Absalom, and upon learning what Amnon had done, said to Tamar, "Be quiet for now, my sister. He is your brother. Don't take this thing to heart." And even as in that time, the rape was downplayed, it still happens today. Oh, it wasn't that bad. Or, well, you shouldn't have been where you were at. Or perhaps you shouldn't have been wearing what you were wearing. And Amnon, well, King David was furious, and Absalom never spoke to him again. Now, Amnon, who was the oldest son of King David, was the heir apparent to the throne of Israel. He never made it to the throne. Ultimately, he was assassinated by his half-brother Absalom to avenge Tamar's rape. Now, in contrast, I want you to think about this story in the book of John as a healthier response to the treatment of survivors of abuse. In chapter 8, verses 1 through 11, Jesus is on the Mount of Olives. He's gone up for his morning prayers and meditation. And then he comes back down from the mount and he goes to the temple courts, something that he did quite often. And it is said he sat down to teach them, the people that came to hear him speak. And when he was there teaching, the teachers of the law and the Pharisees brought in a woman caught in adultery. Now again, notice they didn't bring the man with them. They just brought the woman. They made her stand before the group and said to Jesus, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the act of adultery. In the law given to us by Moses, it commanded us to stone such a woman. What would you say?" So Jesus seemed to at first try to ignore them, doing what he was doing, talking to those other folks that were there, even going so far as to bend down and to start writing in the dirt. But the Pharisees and the teachers pressed on, and eventually he straightened up and he said to them, "Let any of you who is without sin cast the first stone." And again, he stooped down and wrote on the ground. And at this, those who had heard began to go away one at a time, the older ones first, until only Jesus was left with the woman standing. Jesus straightened up and asked her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" The woman replied, "No, sir." And Jesus said to her, "Then neither do I condemn you. Go now and leave your life of sin." Now, we all know that Jesus was a radical in his days. He was like the first hippie, the first radical. And in these few verses, Jesus models a masculinity that recognizes the dignity of women and challenges the views of what others have accepted. Because in this case, for example, Moses' law said, practically speaking, approximately 1 in 3 women and 1 in 7 men will experience some form of domestic violence in their lifetime. Approximately 1 out of every 6 women has been the victim of an attempted or completed rape in her lifetime. And about 1 in 33 men have experienced an attempted or completed rape in their lifetime. And these numbers are why places like Dove still exist, to provide services, to those harmed by abuse over which they have no control. Simply leaving often isn't an option. Financially, children, we worry if we leave this relationship, what will happen? Will we become homeless? Will we have to go to a shelter like Dove and stay there? Will Child Protective Services get involved because maybe they witnessed the abuse? And will our children be taken from us? And so oftentimes the victim, be it the man or the woman, will stay in that relationship. And the question shouldn't be, why do they stay? The question should be, why do they batter? So even now, as Dove goes into its 25th year, I believe, of being in existence, we still provide services to those who are harmed by abuse. We provide personal and group advocacy, a 24-hour hotline, safe house, legal advocacy, including court accompaniment, food, clothing, and in some instances, financial assistance. And we come to this point where each of us must ask ourselves, what can I do? Instead of burying our heads in the sand or lamenting that I'm only one person and can't take on such a huge problems, leaders can teach and preach a theology to prevent and interrupt domestic or sexual violence. Church members can listen, believe, and provide referrals to agencies like Dove, who can provide further assistance to survivors. Churches can become sanctuaries again, safe, healthy, healing spaces for survivors, and we can use our voices individually and as a congregation to advocate for policies that hold perpetrators accountable and provide support to the survivors and, when applicable, their children. We can't do this work without you. We cannot end this violence without each of you, men and women, young and old, to stand up for those who have not yet found their voice, allow those who have found their voice to tell their story, knowing that those around them are holding them up, supporting them, believing them. Be clear that violence, even when used under the guise of discipline, is not acceptable, and be consistent. Hold the victims in your prayers and the batterers accountable. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
Thank you. God bless you.